Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this second training in the series for certified local governments. Today's topic is about the history of historic preservation. I figured it was a good idea to kind of get the background of the development of historic preservation. This focuses on it in the United States. Obviously, there's a broader scope of things that you can study as well, but hopefully this will give a good background for you all. All right, so to start, what is historic preservation? I really liked this quote, so I'm just going to use their definition. Historic preservation seeks to protect the uniqueness and therefore the identity of places. With place preserved, we can recognize where we belong and understand more fully who we are. And that's by J. Vaught and Stephen Rogers in Picturing the Past. And now going to the roots of it, at least in the United States, where did preservation start? One of the first ever organized historic preservation efforts in the United States was in the 1850s. Local ladies realized that George Washington's home was beginning to deteriorate and formed the Mount Vernon Ladies Association to both restore and administer the sites to save it for future generations. Galvanized by this first effort, similar organizations began to form, mostly focused on the protecting properties of prominent American persons. A bit of a tongue twister. The kind of next step that took place along this timeline was the development of national monuments. In 1872, Yellowstone National Park was created by an act of Congress, making it the first federally protected national park and the first federal attempt at conservation at all. Congress was inspired by California's Yosemite Act of 1864, and Yosemite was the first state park. In 1892, Casa Grande, Arizona was established as the first prehistoric and cultural reserve in the United States in an effort to repair and protect the ruins from increasing vandalism and souvenir hunting from tourists. And this was true of many sites across the United States. Basically, looting to take a souvenir home was just normalized at that point in time. So this started a better trend. Next came the Antiquities Act. With the rise of industrialization in the United States and the ongoing looting of archaeological sites, Americans started to grow worried about the preservation of the landscapes and history of the United States. In 1906, Congress passed the Antiquities Act to protect nationally significant sites and allow the president to designate national monuments. President Theodore Roosevelt declared Devil's Tower as the first national monument. So Wyoming is getting a lot of the first national park and the first national monument. Pretty cool of us. In 1916, the National Park Service was formed within the Department of the Interior and tasked with protecting and managing the 35 existing national parks and monuments. At present, the NPS manages 431 individual units, as they describe, including 63 National Historic Parks, such as Fort Laramie National Historic Site, 85 national monuments, such as Fossil Butte National Monument, and 63 national parks, such as Grand Teton National Park. And this picture is from Grand Teton. In 1931, citizens of Charleston, South Carolina formed the first historic district in the United States. The goal of this district was to protect their historic resources from the encroachment of the automobile, the popularization of which was literally reshaping the United States. And I have a cool series of photos I can show you later on that kind of really show that clearly. The historic district was strengthened by a zoning ordinance to prevent the construction of automobile-related businesses in the city center. An architectural review board was also established to review exterior alterations to the building and provide a certificate of appropriateness if the change was deemed acceptable. The Charleston Historic District became a blueprint which formed the basis for many historic districts in the United States, and they successfully preserved their downtown. So This was a very important landmark moment. The next, I guess, step along the journey of historic preservation was the Historic Sites Act. And this came out of the New Deal, which sought to employ millions of Americans impacted by the Great Depression. And through that, the Civil Works Administration passed the Historic Sites, Buildings, and Antiquities Act in 1935. And this authorized the National Park Service to do a whole laundry list of things. So you can see out here, it allowed the National Park Service to carry out programs to survey, research, and acquire historic and archaeological sites of national significance, collect documents, photographs, and objects associated with sites, cooperate with states, organizations, and individuals to preserve or operate sites, restore sites and maintain museums, erect commemorative tablets, operate and manage sites acquired under the Act, and develop public education programs. One of the other interesting parts of this act was for the documentation of lots of these historic buildings. They worked with the American Institute of Architects to employ 1,000 out-of-work architects. So yeah, it really hit different sectors of the United States that needed work at that time. Following that came the National Trust for Historic Preservation. This is a name that you'll still see around today. In 1949, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, NTHP, was formed out of the need to create a national organization to support local preservation efforts. Initially, the focus of the NTHP was on the acquisition and administration of historic sites. The first historic place acquired in 1951 was the Woodlawn Plantation in Virginia. Today, the focus of the NTHP is on saving America's historic sites, telling the American story, building communities, and investing in the future of preservation. Many programs were founded by the NTHP, so they started a whole bunch of other historic preservation efforts in the U.S. This includes the National Main Street Program, America's 11 Most Endangered Places, and the This Place Matters movement as well. And as we get into later 40s and 50s, this is post-World War II America, and it saw an explosion of growth that was further spurred on by two different acts, the Housing Act of 1949 and the Urban Renewal Act of 1954. We were seeking to house a whole bunch of people in the growing cities, and these acts sought to provide stimulus for the purchase and clearing of deteriorated or blighted, in their opinion, urban neighborhoods. Unfortunately, many of these cleared areas never received investors, which left them vacant and unused. So rather than holding something deteriorating that was maybe someone's house, it was just an empty lot that sat there for potentially years or decades. Additionally, the construction of the interstate highway system resulted in the demolition of many existing, often low-income neighborhoods. In response to the constant destruction of buildings, a citizen, Jane Jacobs, wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities in 1961. She argued that older buildings helped shape the sense of community in a neighborhood, and that preservation should be more important than constant new developments. And there's just a little quote from her about the book, that it is an attack on current city planning and rebuilding. Her book struck a chord with Americans, convincing them that preservation was about far more than just landmarks. And then this is a cool, website. It has a series of photos where you can go between satellite image views of decades of cities, and you can very clearly see the way that especially the highway system kind of carved its way through neighborhoods. I'm going to see if I can pull that up without messing everything up. We'll see. Okay, so I'm going to try sharing this tab. And I won't show everything, but I will just show you a couple, I guess, of examples on here. The first one is Cincinnati, 1955 to 2013. And so you can see this is the 1955 version of the city. And then when you pull the tab over, it overlays the 2013 overview. And you can see the clear way in which neighborhoods were disrupted by roads. And still today, there aren't quite as many people living in those areas. Another one that I very much liked was Kansas City from 1955 to 2014. So you can see pretty dense blocks of neighborhoods. And now in the middle, there are a lot of different roadways. And so again, we just disrupted this way of life that once existed. And let's see if I can get back to my presentation. Oh no, it caused an issue. Here we go. Yay, we've returned. So yeah, if you want to, I'm sharing this presentation with everyone, and so you can explore the site a little bit further if you'd like. I just thought it was a great visualization of the really extreme changes that have taken place in kind of urban planning and just the general layout of cities. And yeah, it's super interesting. This is one of the big examples of I guess a historic preservation failure that ended up galvanizing other historic preservation protections in the long run. This is the New York City Penn Station demolition. The Pennsylvania Station was built in New York in 1910 in a Beaux Arts style. You can see in that like bottom image, it's very grand looking, very impressive windows and glasswork, all of that. But it was also impacted by the car becoming a more common mode of transportation, and also by air travel. So in general, the Pennsylvania Railroad ridership began to decline, and with less ridership, there was less money for both the upkeep of the station, and the vendors within the station had fewer customers, so there were fewer vendors in the long run. Things just started to deteriorate, grow more empty. And in the end, to make more of a profit of a space that was losing them money, the railroad executives made a deal with New York City to sell the station to the city and use its footprint to create a new, more profitable set of buildings. And again, I've linked, there's an interesting New York Times article that had some more some interesting details. And then I also just really like the images that they used as well. In 1961, the demolition of the station was announced, and the following years, the Action Group for Better Architecture publicly protested and voiced their dissent at City Planning Commission meetings, but only a few hundred New Yorkers ever joined in the protests. So they were very passionate, but unfortunately, people didn't really start caring until it was a bit too late. So despite the protests, the demolition of the station began in 1963 to make way for the construction of Madison Square Garden, a little building. And in 1965, the New York Landmarks Law was passed in part as a response to the demolition of Penn Station. And that law provides significantly more protections for historic buildings like Penn Station in the city. So the next book that provided even more than Jane Jacobs, it kind of took what she started and galvanized it entirely, was With Heritage So Rich. And this was a collaboration between the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the National Trust for Historic Preservation that we mentioned earlier. The book used poignant photography to show the buildings that have already been lost and urged for more action to be taken to preserve historic sites before it was too late. It outlined 4 main initiatives: the creation of a national level historic preservation program, a national survey of significant historic properties, a list or a register of significant historic properties, and partnerships between all levels of the government on historic preservation. And in this case, they were successful, which is very exciting. It led to, somewhat directly, the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. They did, in fact, create legislation based on the recommendations in With Heritage So Rich. And so you'll see there's another big list. This is the biggest piece of historic preservation legislation in the United States. It remains the backbone of preservation today, and almost everything that we have now links back to this 1966 law. So it established the National Register of Historic Places, the National Landmarks Program. It authorized funds for historic preservation activities. It created state and tribal historic preservation offices, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. It enshrined the protection of historic property owners so that the federal government could not interfere with their private property rights. And it also created the Section 106 process, which evaluates the impact of projects using federal funds or by federal agencies on historic sites. And again, that is an ongoing process that has protected many, many structures and sites. So let's go into a little bit more detail with the National Register of Historic Places. It was founded, like we just said, as a result of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, and it is the federally recognized list of the United States' most significant historic places, or some of them, and is administered by the National Park Service. Listing a property on the National Register is a form of acknowledgement and prestige, but it does not place any restraints on the property. It does not restrict the rights of the private property owners to use, develop, or sell the property. This could potentially impact its status on the National Register, but there would be no actual repercussions on the private property owner. As of 2023, there are more than 98,000 properties listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and currently Wyoming has 571 of those, and each county has at least 5 sites listed. And some are like downtown historic districts, so there will be a whole bunch of different significant sites within this one National Register district nomination. Going into National Historic Landmarks, this is an interactive map you can visit that I put together. It'll be linked here, and I think I may have linked it in another place on our website. But essentially, you can click on each one, and I did my best to get you to like in some cases, the state park site or other information that you can get about it. So National Historic Landmarks were also established as part of the National Historic Preservation Act, and they hold even more rigorous criteria, designation criteria than the NRHPs that we just talked about. NHLs must have national or even international levels of significance. So out of a list of very important sites, these are the most important sites. There are currently 28 NHLs in Wyoming, including the state capitol, Independence Rock, and the Old Faithful Inn. The NPS defines NHLs as historic properties that illustrate the heritage of the United States. The over 2,600 NHLs found in the U.S. today come in many forms: historic buildings, sites, structures, objects, and districts. Each NHL represents an outstanding aspect of American history and culture. And the most recent one, I don't know if they have the official actual NHL nomination available online yet, but is Quebec One right here in Cheyenne. And it is a very cool site. And so, yeah, each one kind of represents, in this case, Cold War history. And we have a good handful of them. This one is about Historic Preservation Month, which started as Historic Preservation Week in May of 1973. And it was created by the National Trust for Historic Preservation's desire to better communicate the successes and progress being made in historic preservation throughout the nation. In 2005, Preservation Week was extended to Preservation Month and would now take place throughout all of May. Historic preservation organizations all around the country now celebrate their successes, promote historic places, and encourage heritage tourism in their communities each May. Here in Wyoming, the Alliance for Historic Wyoming has been doing an amazing job fostering historic preservation in Wyoming. said Wyoming a lot. You can find their calendar of historic preservation events here, and that's another link you can click to take to their website. We also have some graphics from this year's Main Street program. So they're always good about coordinating things and having events throughout the month of May. Feel free to reach out to them, and they can put you on their calendar of events if there's things you want to help reach more people. This is a bit more in depth about the Tax Reform Act that happened in 1976 and 1978. The Tax Reform Act of 1976 made it so that developers could no longer use the destruction of historic structures as a building expense, essentially removing the ability to be reimbursed for the demolition. And then in 1978, the Tax Reform Act was amended to establish a tax credit for the rehabilitation of income-generating historic buildings. Structures would have to be deemed as certified historic structures by the National Park Service to be eligible for the program. The program allows 20% of qualified expenses on a certified rehabilitation project to be claimed as a credit on federal income taxes. The Wyoming State Historic Preservation Office, SHPO, serves as the liaison between the property owner and the National Park Service. The goal of this combined endeavor is to encourage preservation of community treasures and increase awareness of the benefits of rehabilitation efforts. Since 1976, there have been 43,000 tax credit projects nationally that have leveraged almost $90 billion in private investment in the rehabilitation of historic properties. So it's been a success. In 1980, there were amendments to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And before that happened in 1976, the Historic Preservation Fund was authorized, and this has remained the primary federal funding source for historic preservation. Following that in 1980, the NHPA was amended to include a provision for the creation of certified local governments within each state. Funding for State Historic Preservation Office, SHPOs, through the Historic Preservation Fund was also authorized. Once certified, CLGs would be able to apply for CLG grants through their SHPO, with each office required to give out 10% of their total federal funding in the form of these grants. 1980 also marked the inception of the Main Street program by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Section 110 was also introduced by the amendments, which required each federal agency to establish a historic preservation program to identify and protect historic properties. So it kind of works in tandem with Section 106. And here I have some of my sources and further reading that you might want to look into. It was difficult, but I stopped at 1980 with the historic preservation history. You know, that's about 50 years ago, and that's what we tend to consider historic in the field. And I wanted to also let you know that the next training is about the National Register of Historic Places and will be held on Wednesday, November 20th at 1 p.m. And that will be led by Casey Woster, our National Register for Historic Places coordinator. So look forward to that. And now I have time for questions.